Hello, everyone. Today we have the privilege of having a special guest join us on the channel, and he is Dr. Joe Rigney. Dr. Rigney is a theologian, a theologian, author, and educator known for his work at New St. Andrews College and Bethlehem College and Seminary. He has written several books, including The Things of Earth, Treasuring God by Enjoying His Gifts, and Live Like a Narnian, Christian Discipleship in Lewis's Chronicles. He's likewise known for his title, The Sin of Empathy, where he has shown that the modern way of how we view empathy can be sinful. Dr. Rigney, thank you so very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today.
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Now, I know I gave everyone a very brief description, but can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your life, your conversion, and your other work in the ministry?
Yeah, I was raised in West Texas in a nominal Christian home. And then when I was, still in elementary school, my parents became more serious Christians, started going to a different church. And so that's really where my kind of more spiritual journey really began in earnest. And coming out of high school, I went to Texas A&M University, and while I was there, felt a call to ministry, wanted to go be a pastor. That was largely the influence of John Piper. I started reading John Piper's books in college, and those were life-changing for me. And so from there, I actually went to seminary in Minneapolis at Bethlehem. At the time, it was called the Bethlehem Institute. Yeah, and I so studied under Piper, and then got a job there. I actually became a professor. So while I was in seminary, I realized how much I love the classroom, and so I pivoted from a focus on being a pastor as my main vocation to a professor. And then I taught at Bethlehem for 15 years, something like that. And so I taught the Bible and theology and history and literature and a whole bunch of stuff in our college at Bethlehem, and became president at Bethlehem for a couple of years. And then 2 years ago, made a shift and came out to here to New St. Andrews in Moscow, Idaho, where I'm a professor at New St. Andrews and a pastor here at Christ Church. So that's a little bit of how from Texas to Minnesota to Idaho. So I've kind of been all over the country.
Oh, great, great, fantastic. So what I would like to talk about primarily today is your aforementioned title, The Sin of Empathy.
Yeah.
Could you please provide us with a basic summary of this title before I probe into some specifics?
Yeah, so the basic idea is one, I'll use C.S. Lewis as the way into the discussion. Lewis wrote a book called The Four Loves, in which he argued that any human love of your family, love of your friends, love of your romantic love, when they become gods, they become demons. When they elevate themselves to deity, when they become untethered from God's love, they become destructive. So mother love is a great thing, but when it's not anchored to God's love, it can become possessive and tyrannical. And my argument in the book is that compassion is the same sort of thing. Love for the weak and the hurting is a great good. It's Jesus modeled it for us. The Bible commands us to be compassionate and tenderhearted and kind. But when it becomes untethered from what's true and what's good, when it becomes detached from those other, from that deeper reality, that becomes destructive. And so that's what I mean by the sin of empathy. In the same way that we know that anger, for example, other passions like anger, there's righteous anger and unrighteous anger. I'm wanting to argue there's good empathy, bad empathy. There's sinful compassion, there's virtuous compassion. And so sin of empathy refers to that untethered empathy that's untethered from what is true and what's good.
Great, great. Thank you for that summation. And so I guess a number of people will point to this particular text, the one where Paul talks about weeping with those who weep. What is the correct exegesis of this passage? And why is it the case that modern understandings of applying empathy here are not faithful ways of applying this text?
Yeah, so weep with those who weep. And there's actually, it's twofold. It's weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. So there is an element of emotion sharing that's happening here. And in itself, emotion sharing is a kind of neutral thing. The question is, well, what are the tears over? What's the joy over? If someone's rejoicing because they just harmed someone, should we join them in that joy? Well, presumably not. Presumably, if someone's done something evil and they're happy, we shouldn't join them in that joy. Similarly, if someone's weeping over something evil. So I remember when Roe v. Wade was overturned, I watched a clip of some people who were weeping over the fact that this unjust law had been overturned, and they were weeping. Should I have, in obedience to that command, wept with them over that abortion was now was on the table? We could now ban it. Well, of course not. So all of that weeping with those who weep mean is always in the framework of a Christian moral framework. It means that those tears need to be tied to what God says is true and good. And so in that respect, I want to say absolutely we should weep with those who weep, but we need to make sure that our tears are conforming to God's standards. What has He said is true? What has He said is good? And do our tears conform to that? But if they do, then absolutely we should share those emotions insofar as we can. But that often requires maintaining a certain kind of emotional distance in order to be able to evaluate whether or not that's true or not, whether or not can I. So, and I think the modern version of empathy often says you have to check any judgment at the door. If I'm sad, you need to just affirm, validate, celebrate my feelings. Whatever I feel, you have to endorse. And if you don't, then you're not loving me. You're not being kind. You're being heartless. You're being cruel because you won't join me in my emotions. And I think Christians can't do that. Biblical compassion always reserves the right not to lie and not to blaspheme, not to reject God.
Right, I totally agree. In the book, you attempt to navigate the reader into a course of authentic biblical sympathy and compassion, but you also address another key pitfall. How can we avoid ending up in the other extreme, in a sense, the opposite extreme of empathy, and that is the sin of apathy?
Yeah, this is a real danger. So, when you've got biblical stories, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the two guys who walked by on the other side of the road, showed a callous indifference to this man's suffering. And so it's important that we not react against the soup of emotions by denying the goodness of emotions or rejecting this idea of compassion. Instead, what we do is we say what has Christ modeled for us? What does the Bible teach us to do? And so you have examples where Jesus joins Mary and Martha in their sadness. I spend the end of the book actually examines that particular episode as a model of Christian compassion, where Lazarus is dead. Jesus knows he's going to raise him, but he still joins them in their sorrow, and he weeps over the death of Lazarus. That's a good example of tethered compassion. But it also shows us that there's boundaries. So, for example, in the book of Job, we have an example where Job's wife has just lost 10 children. She's understandably very, very grieved and heartbroken over this loss. She's angry. And she comes to Job, who's also grieving, and says, "Are you still holding fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." Now, at that moment, what should Job do? Well, he shouldn't join her in her blasphemy. She's cursing God. She's saying God's the bad guy. And Job says, "You're speaking foolishly." He remains tethered to what's true, but he's still weeping over the loss of his children. He still can join his wife in that sorrow, but he can't join her in the sin. And so that's the need. That's what we're trying to thread. That's the needle we're trying to thread is, on the one hand, deep feeling, deep emotion, absolutely, but anchored emotion that can be governed and guided by what God says is true and good.
Right, right. Now, I did read as much of your book as I could. And in your second chapter, you cite a number of characters from a work of C.S. Lewis to drive home solid points about compassion.
Yes.
If you can recall, can you go over some of these figures briefly and how you make application of them?
Yeah. So there's a particular scenario that I think is very poignant. So in this it's from The Great Divorce, which is C.S. Lewis's kind of it's not, he doesn't think this is what the afterlife is like, but he's using it as a way of revealing truth about reality. You have solid spirits, saints, people who have trusted Christ and they're in heaven, and then you have damned ghosts, and they're having conversations in this sort of the green plains, this sort of halfway house between heaven and hell. And the solid spirits are trying to persuade the damned spirits to give up their sin, to turn from their sin, and they can stay. They can come up to heaven. They can go to the mountains. And there's a conversation between a woman who's a saint and her husband, former husband, who's in hell. And through the course of the conversation, it becomes evident that her husband was very manipulative and would often wield his suffering against her to manipulate her. And so at one point, he says, "You're sending me back," because he won't abandon his sin. He says, "Oh, you can be happy without me, and you're sending me back to the cold and the lonely streets of hell." And she says, "Stop it." And he says, "Oh, you can't handle it. You can't handle my suffering." And she says, "No, that's not why I said stop it." She said, "I said stop using pity the wrong way around. That's what you're doing. Pity," he says, is pity is a spur that's supposed to move joy to help misery. It's like a little prod that you're joyful and I'm going to help those who are suffering. But it can be used backwards. It can be used as a kind of blackmail. You can hold joy up to ransom by pity. And she gives the example of when you were a child, this is to her husband, um, you would do something wrong, and then you would go sulk in the attic and refuse to say you were sorry because you knew that eventually your sisters would say, I can't stand the thought of him sitting up there by himself, and that they would come apologize to you. And so that's the kind of dynamic, that emotional blackmail where we say, you don't love me if, and then we make unreasonable, sometimes ungodly demands of people. And anybody who's ever been on the receiving end of a pity party or a guilt trip knows that phenomenon. Or and sometimes we've been on the giving end of one of those, and it's not a good thing. And I'm trying to tell people to say that's the sort of thing that we have to learn how to resist and be willing to be called heartless. You'll be called names, but it's because you actually love that person. You love them enough not to simply let their emotions steer your vehicle.
Got it. Got it. Now, this is going to sound like I'm going through it section by section. It's just for structural purposes. But now
Yeah.
moving on to the third chapter in your book on empathy, it's titled The Sin of Empaths. Why is untethered empathy so destructive?
Yeah, it leads to a couple of things. So, probably the easiest one to think about is empathy acts as a spotlight. Okay, it narrows in on the suffering of certain people and therefore blinds us to the suffering of other people. So, one of the things Lewis taught me is he says pity, when it's detached from justice and divine love, leads through anger to cruelty. Pity leads through anger to cruelty, and you think about it and you realize, yeah. So pity, Lewis says, for the oppressed classes can justify a reign of terror against their oppressors. And so we can feel very compassionate for one group, and therefore we can justify great evil against another group. And I think we see that sort of phenomenon everywhere. There's an author who wrote a book in the same vein. He wasn't a Christian, but he wrote a book years ago called Against Empathy. And he said, when most people hear the word empathy, they think of kindness. When I hear the word empathy, I think of war. Because empathy for my in group means hatred for my out group. I love them so much that I can justify great cruelty and evil to others. So that's the kind of thing that happens when empathy jumps the rails. Is it can justify and rationalize great cruelty in the name of humanitarianism, in the name of compassion. We can do great evil to those that we've dehumanized. We turn them into devils because that they're easier to hate, and we exaggerate their flaws and we can explain it. If someone says, "Why are you doing this?" Well, because I'm being empathetic. And I think that it's interesting to see even secular sources. Over the course of my work on this over the last 7 or 8 years, studies keep coming out where people the thing that social scientists think is, look how polarized we are, look how much division there is in our society. We need more empathy. And then they actually begin to study it and they realize that actually it's the most empathetic people who are the most polarized and tribal because it's a strong emotion and it has this like, well, I'm so committed to this group that I can't even fathom that group. And I want to say, if you actually anchor it to what's true, it can temper that tribalism because you actually can see the humanity in your opponent. It's not just pure and simple hatred because they're evil, but you actually can recognize their humanity because you're not simply viewing them through the lens of this tunnel vision emotion based on your compassion.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. So now turning to the fourth chapter, you delve into an interesting aspect of harmful empathy, and that is its relationship to the various woke groups which we as evangelicals have to deal with today, such as the plus community and Black Lives Matter. You set the stage by discussing Aaron Renn's three world framework. What is this framework and how does it relate to untethered empathy?
Yeah, so Aaron Renn wrote a book called Life in Negative World, and he sets forth this paradigm for thinking about America's secularization. The idea is that at one time in our nation, roughly the 50s through the 90s, Christianity was a social positive. If you to be a good, you want to be a good citizen, you needed to be a good Christian. Everybody wanted to be a Christian. Christian moral framework was the basic framework. Even if people broke it, it was still the acknowledged moral norms of our society, even for those who didn't believe in Jesus. And then beginning in the 90s, he says we shifted into neutral world, where it was much more pluralistic, kind of a pluralistic public square. And Christians were the weird ones. If you were a real Christian, that was odd. You might be tolerated and you might have a seat at the multicultural table, but you were weird. And Christian moral norms still had some influence in society. But then we hit negative world. So kind of post Obergefell, all of a sudden it shifted to where now Christian moral norms weren't just weird, they were evil. If you tried to assert that marriage is between a one man and one woman, it wasn't just that you were an oddball, it is that you were a bad person for saying that, and you could be canceled over it. So that's his basic paradigm. And what I argue in the book, I build on that to say that during that neutral world time, many Christians adopted certain ministry strategies. They wanted to be winsome, and they wanted to have a seat at that pluralistic table in order to commend Christ. But that pluralistic table was governed by progressives. And so Christians became very adept at trying to communicate that the gospel fulfills progressive standards, desires, sensitivities, and hopes. So progressives care about this. Guess what? So does Christianity. And tried to prove that we were meeting the standards that they had. What then happened is that when we shifted into negative world, progressives discovered they could wield that dynamic in order to mute Christian resistance to their agenda. So all they had to do was say, if they said we're going to have gay marriage now, and Christians said, well, we can't do that. Well, you're not being loving. You're not being kind and compassionate. Why can't you be more kind and compassionate? And that would often be enough for many Christians, even if they didn't agree, they would be quiet because they didn't want to be accused. They'd keep their head down because they wouldn't want to be accused of being cruel and heartless and unloving and evil and a bigot. And so out of a desire to show themselves compassionate, they would often go along with various kinds of progressive folly because they were living beneath what I come to call the progressive gaze. The idea is that there's a little progressive sitting on your shoulder evaluating whether you're a good enough Christian. And so you're always doing things with that in mind. Rather than trying to calibrate your actions by God's word, you baptize progressive standards with Christian sounding language. And that's how we kind of migrated through the various phases of wokeness, whether the racial phase or the gendered phase or the LGBTQ phase. All of those different phases and dynamics running underneath them was this notion that true compassion would be defined according to progressive terms, and that Christians needed to prove themselves sufficiently compassionate according to that standard.
Got it. Got it. Now, you already touched on this just a moment ago, the progressive gaze. So could you give like an anecdotal or
Yeah.
possibly a direct example of how this would work in practice, the progressive gaze?
Yeah, so I think when it came to things like the racial conversation, I think that what people began to feel is that in order to prove that we are faithful Christians, we have to prove that we care about this. So the putting up of the Black Lives Matter, the black square on your social media, or flying the Black Lives Matter flag was a way of signaling to other people, I care about this thing deeply, and I'm trying to prove that I'm the right kind of Christian. And oftentimes this was coupled with a distancing from the wrong kind of Christian. The progressive gaze, one of the ways, because we discover how do you ingratiate yourself with one audience? Well, communicate, show that you dislike or that you're not a part of their opponents. And so many Christians who are living under the progressive gaze, they began to operate and say, we're not like those Christians. We're not like those culture warrior Christians, that moral majority Christians, these old Christians. We distance ourselves from them. We're different. We're a different kind of Christian. And so I think you saw that play out over and over, and it actually fractured a lot of churches as people began to try to prove one way or the other, right? That we're not that kind of Christian, or that we are. And so the divisions that kind of shot through the church over issues of race and abuse and things like that were often driven by trying to prove to different audiences what kind of Christian we were.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. So chapter 5 of your book. Now,
Yeah.
it deals with an ideology that we cover quite a bit on this channel, and that is feminism.
Okay.
And I might be a little biased, but this was my favorite chapter of your book.
Okay. Okay.
Can you explain the role the egalitarian worldview plays in helping spread pathological empathy?
Yeah, so the basic idea here is that women are the more empathetic sex. Just as a fact of nature, God has designed men and women differently, with different strengths, different tendencies, different temptations. And female empathy is actually a great gift from God. It's one of the reasons why women are often the first responders when people are in pain. They want to lean in, they want to welcome people, comfort people. It's why when kids are growing up in a home, if they fall down, dad's like, just rub some dirt on it, get up and keep playing, and mom's like, come here, let me give you a hug. And so that tendency, that female empathy, is a gift, and it's a complement to that sort of more masculine distance and so forth. But that means that what's a blessing in one place, the glue that holds communities together in terms of the kindness and compassion and so forth, is a blessing in there, but it becomes destructive when it's put in a different place. And one of those places is in that role of guardianship. So if we're talking about whether it's guarding the doctrine and worship of the church, so when it's the question of women as pastors with female pastors, or you could widen it out if you were going to do cultural and you talk about women in the military. The notion is that this is not the place for that female compassion. It's destructive here because it doesn't belong there. And so, and some men obviously can be very kind and tenderhearted and susceptible to this as well. But on average, it's going to show up there. So once there's a reason that many of the denominations that adopted female pastors back in like the 50s, 60s, and 70s very quickly abandoned the scriptures when it came to sexual morality, right? They all of a sudden they affirmed gay marriages, or they had ordained gay clergy, and they fly the rainbow flag. And it's invariably churches that have female ministers that are leading the way on that. Men go along, but women are often leading the way. And I think it's a good illustration. And what's leading them is their compassion for so-called victims. This is an oppressed community, and we want to show them, quote unquote, the love of Christ. And so we're going to affirm and validate their identities and pursue justice on their behalf in society. And it's women that are leading the way because their female empathy has got away from them. And so because of that, it's important for conservative churches to learn to hold the line all the way down and not succumb to that false feminist and egalitarian lie that men and women are interchangeable. They're not. They have different strengths and weaknesses, and we should play to their strengths, and we should guard against the weaknesses. And this is one that the feminization of society, the feminization of the church, is a destructive one, and has greatly harmed the Christian faithfulness.
So you mentioned the church and you mentioned the military.
Yeah.
Do you think that what you say about empathy can also impact government and politics?
Yeah, I think in general, um, uh, it's not the same kind of blanket prohibition that we find for women in ministry. God guards the sanctuary, the doctrine and worship of the church more tightly. But in general, I think it's normal and healthy for societies to have political leaders who are men, because because they're constituted in a certain way to set the perimeter and guard those boundaries, whether it's the actual border, whether it's ordering men into service. And I think that the proliferation of female politicians, it alters the dynamics. And one of the ways it does so is actually because men and women relate to each other in a particular way. And good men, especially, have been taught since they were young, you don't hit girls. You don't, you can wrestle with the boys, but you don't wrestle with the girls. You can, if if a male friend is doing something wrong, you not tell him to knock it off, and if he fights back, you fight him. But you don't do that to ladies. You treat them differently. You treat them with honor as the weaker vessel. That's the way the Bible talks. What that means is that when you have a mixed group, say a deliberative body, where a woman is advocating for something that's destructive, it's much harder for a good man to resist her because he will look like he's a bully. It will look like if he were to treat her and her ideas the same way that he would treat the corresponding ideas in a man, like he could oppose the man directly, because that's how men, like, we're gonna you say your idea is good, I say your idea is bad. Let's debate it. Let's talk about it and let's push on each other. But if he speaks with that same kind of directness to her, other men are actually going to come to her aid and say, "Hey, stop being a bully," and they're going to try to mute him. And so as a result, it puts an asymmetry in the dynamics. And I think that we've seen that play out. And so it's not, I'm not like it's a blanket prohibition or something like that. I don't know that we can get that far, but I think a healthy society will have lots of male leadership up and down the line, from the home to the church, out into the public square, with women fulfilling the role that God has given them, which is assisting, beautifying, glorifying, motherhood, all of these sort of great callings, that women have. They fulfill those, and then men are the ones who are setting the perimeter, acting in the city gates, on behalf of the society.
Okay. We're spending more time on this, but it's a big
Yeah,
part
that's
of the
fine.
audience, so I'm going to ask you one more question.
That's great.
You mentioned she-wolves and female sheep in the book.
Yeah.
What is a she-wolf and what is a female sheep?
Yeah, so well, Jesus says, right, that there'll be I send you out as sheep amongst wolves. At some, there'll be wolves in sheep's clothing. So these are wolves masquerading as sheep. And I think that in many cases, this is a good example. Men know how to resist male wolves. So good shepherds know how to fight male wolves, but she wolves, meaning false teachers who present themselves in a vulnerable way. They present themselves as herding sheep. And when they do that, even good men really struggle to know how to deal with that, because resisting looks like they're being the bully, like they're being bad. And so because of that, she wolves are able to prey on weak sheep, female sheep. And Paul talks about this. He mentions the sort of false teachers who creep into the houses of weak women and lead them astray by their passions. And he says you've got to watch out for that, and that men can do that and prey on weak women, and women can do that and prey on weak women. And I think in our society, we see that in a lot of different circumstances. That starts out well intentioned. It starts out like we want to help hurting people, but then people realize that's a vulnerability. And if we present ourselves as the greatest victim, then this church or this community will reorient itself around us and our desires, our agenda, and we can neutralize any resistance by our victimhood. And I think that we talked a moment ago, like the victimhood Olympics that we lived through over the last decade, in which various subgroups, identity groups, competed to see who was the greatest victim, because the greatest victim wins. The greatest victim is at the top of the pyramid, and everybody will orient around their agenda. And I think the church facilitated that. I think it happened. I think it divided a lot of churches, and feminism was a key element in making that driving that engine.
One more question, then I'll move on to the next one.
Yeah.
So Michael Foster, I think it was Michael Foster, had said that churches which have female pastors, now I don't believe there's such a thing as a female pastor, but churches that have female leaders, they tend to fall into liberalism. Do you think that what he's saying there is connected to what you say about empathy?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's how, because basically, if when a woman's in that position of leadership, and the job of pastor, the fundamental thing, what do pastors do? They guard the doctrine and worship of the church. They function in the New Testament the way priests functioned in the Old Testament, and priests were given swords to guard the sanctuary. That was the priestly task. Yes, it was aid the worshiper and offering the sacrifices and that kind of mediatorial role. But a key thing that Levites were charged with was, this is sacred space, and you have to guard it. And you were given a sword in order to do that, lest any unclean thing come in. Well, if you say, okay, we're going to give the sword, this guardianship role, to a woman, and then up to the door comes someone presenting themselves as a victim, but who's unclean, who's believing falsehood, teaching falsehoods, a woman is going to be more prone to let that in, to open the door, and out of a desire for compassion, let this error into the sanctuary. And so I think that that's exactly why you see that phenomenon that Michael Foster's described. Wayne Grudem's also written a whole book, I think, on this subject, describing that evangelical feminism is a new path to liberalism, and this is how it works, because women are the more empathetic sex.
Yeah, I think that book's back.
Is it? Good, yeah.
I think so.
Good one.
So the final chapter of your book is In Praise of Compassion. What is some of the advice you provide for believers in this closing section?
Yeah, so having spent a bunch of the book talking about the dangers of compassion and the way it can be corrupted into this untethered empathy, I wanted to make sure I closed with, I'm not saying, be indifferent to suffering. And I think probably the most helpful thing there is I try to sort of give a vision of what does tethered compassion look like whenever it faces suffering. And it looks like acknowledging the hardship that someone is facing. So even if you don't agree fully with their analysis of this situation, you can say, this is really hard. You can say, you can acknowledge their emotions about the situation. I know you feel that way. I see your emotions. I know you feel that way. And you can do that without necessarily saying, and I agree 100% that you should feel that way. Again, think about Job's wife. So I think Job could have looked at her and said, I know why you feel this way. This is hard. Our kids are dead. And I know you feel that way. But, and then you can say, I'm with you in this. I'm joining you. I'm going to sit with you in the dark, in this pit, in your suffering and your sorrow. I can join you in it. But the key thing is, I still have hope. I still am connected to Christ. I still am anchored to him. And so if you're going to try to, if in your suffering, you want me to cut myself off from Jesus, I can't go there. And you don't have to say that in the moment when in the grieving mother, unless she's demanding it. But if she's just sad, you can just sit with her. You can just sit with that grieving friend, and in sorrow and sadness, and know that many of the words that are being said are just words for the wind. You can absorb all of that, but you can't join them in that. You can't validate that. And if they demand, as Job's wife did, if they demand that you do, curse God and die, and they put you on the spot, that's where your hope in Christ has to be stronger than their emotions. And you have to say, that's the one place I can't go. I can't join you in the lie, but I can join you in the suffering. And so I try to commend that as a biblical way to engage with people who are suffering. I give some examples, the biblical example from Jesus and Mary and Martha, as well as an example from Brothers Karamazov. Um, and so as to just kind of illustrate, like, this is what it looks like in practice, because we still want to, in the face of the counterfeits, we want the real, genuine version. We want the genuine article of compassion and not its knockoffs.
Got it. Got it. Now, you already mentioned Mary and Martha, but I think there was another example that you gave in that closing chapter where Jesus righteously uses compassion. Do you remember?
That was the one I could think of. There may have been others where he's moved with compassion to help, to heal people
Yeah.
frequently, right? But that's a good example of, like, he's not doing. This is the difference between Christ's compassion and the modern worldly untethered empathy. Christ sees someone who's hurting and distressed, and he moves to relieve the pain and the suffering. But what he doesn't do is, like, today, this person is feeling distressed and emotionally distressed because they think they're in the wrong body. And Jesus isn't going to say, well, therefore, I'm going to affirm you that you've been in the wrong body. He's going to say, no, I want your soul to be healed so that you embrace the God-given identity that you have as a man or a woman. He's not going to say, let's cut off the limb. Let's castrate them.
Yeah.
That's a false compassion, because it's indulging the lie, as opposed to a true compassion, which would seek to heal the soul that is sick, and that is believing lies about themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. I like how you flesh that out, that we want to stay balanced. We don't want to be empathetic and we don't want to be apathetic. We want to stay sympathetic and
Yeah,
compassionate, and using our Lord as the model. Do
right.
you have any new projects planned you can tell us about?
Yeah, so we're about to have our a conference next week here in Moscow, on it's our Grace annual conference. The theme is on Narnia. It's the 75th anniversary of Narnia. I've got a book, Live Like a Narnian, that I wrote on that, but I'm working on a new project. It's still mid-phase development. Hopefully I'll get to work on it a little bit more. But on Puddleglum, actually. So Puddleglum's one of my favorite Narnian characters, and so I've got a book called Puddleglum's Faith that's in development. And then I've got some other things that in the works, a little book on Shakespeare. What else? And then some stuff related to Negative World. We've got a multi-authored book engaging with Aaron Wren's work on Negative World, and some stuff on Christian nationalism. So kind of a wide range of different projects. Some are chapters, some are books, but that's some of the stuff that I'm currently working on.
Fantastic, fantastic.
Yeah.
And your books, they can be found on both Amazon and Canon Press.
Yeah. So Amazon, Canon Press. So you can go to, if you want this book, sinofempathy.com. You can get it straight from the publisher. Or if you want to get it, you want to listen to it, canonplus.com. You can subscribe to Canon Plus. Use Joe99 as a coupon code, and you get it for 99 cents for your first month. And then you can just listen to the book. And if you like it, stick with it. If not, well, you can find other things to do with your money, I guess.
Can you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, Joe_Rigney is my Twitter handle. It's the only social media that I do. And then, yeah, Canon Plus is probably the best place. Most of my stuff kind of funnels through there these days. So,
Fantastic.
yeah.
Dr. Rigney, Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.